Hi everyone, thanks for joining me again. In this video, we're going to look more closely at the role that our thoughts play in driving and maintaining the vicious cycle of OCD. But we're also going to look at some ways that we can begin to manage these thoughts differently when they come up for us. Our brains are constantly processing and filtering information that we get from the world around us. It's our brain's job to take this information, analyse it, and then give us back a set of instructions which tell us how we might need to respond. This happens in the form of thoughts. Our brains are doing this all the time, often without us even realising. Imagine a conveyor belt which runs continuously through our heads, carrying thoughts along with it. Most of these we barely notice. But our brain's most important job is to detect and pick out any potential dangers in our environment so that we can protect ourselves. This means that our brain is extra good at honing in on potential risks and really good at generating thoughts that urge us to take the safest course of action. One way of thinking about this is that our minds come ready equipped with a little protective advisor. This advisor's job is to analyse possible risk, to warn us by giving us catastrophic thoughts, and to then give us instructions about the things that we could do to prevent these disasters from happening. This means that every now and again, our advisor will place a scary what-if thought onto our conveyor belt. This is natural, but what makes these thoughts really difficult to ignore is that they often contain a small grain of truth or possibility. And this means that we can't be 100% certain that if we ignore them, the bad thing won't happen. This shows that our brains are working well. The problem is that for some of us, our brains do this a little too well, and we find it difficult to know which are the what-if thoughts that we can ignore and which are the what-if thoughts that we need to respond to. In this way, our well-meaning protective advisor can become a bit of a bully, pushing us around to avoid the things that will trigger anxious feelings or to do things that make us feel safe again. When we respond to our thoughts and follow our advisor's instructions, we might actually feel relieved, better for a little while. But it's not long before the same thoughts show up again on our conveyor belt and we have to start all over again. This means that over time, our advisor can get bigger, louder, bossier, meaning that the what-if thoughts show up more regularly for us. And we begin to believe that it was only because we responded that we prevented the what-if from happening. We all have an inner advisor, a part of us with our best intentions at heart, but a part that can also become overly cautious and end up pushing us around. We can't turn this advisor off, and therefore we can't turn off the intrusive thoughts it gives us. In fact, we wouldn't want to, because to some degree, this part of our brain is needed to keep us safe. So if we can't turn it off, what can we do? First, we probably have to accept that our advisor will be with us through life, and at times when life is difficult, it's likely it will become noisier and more noticeable, and give us more of these scary thoughts. While ever there are things we care about, we're likely to experience intrusive thoughts. In a nutshell, if we get rid of our advisor and the thoughts that it generates, we also have to get rid of the things that are important to us. So we don't have the power to stop our thoughts, but we do have the power to change our response to them. Our aim is to be able to notice these thoughts without responding to them, to notice and acknowledge thoughts without letting them push us around. The more we can do this with kindness and compassion, the easier it becomes to notice the thoughts that we have, without having to do anything with them and without becoming frustrated by them. So, how do we do it? 1. Notice and unhook from the thoughts our mind gives us. It might seem simple and obvious to say, but the first step is realising that thoughts are exactly that, thoughts, not actions. Thoughts which do impact how we feel, but thoughts which are not facts, not premonitions, and not prophecies of the future. Thoughts will come and go all the time on our conveyor belts, but the ones which are scary or are attached to things that matter to us are the ones that tend to grab our attention, and the ones that we want to do something about or make go away. The result? That thought gets stuck or reoccurs for us all of the time. If we're able to notice the thought we are having and observe it as a thought our mind has given us in that moment, but not something we need to do anything about, it becomes easier for us to take a step back and allow that conveyor belt to keep on rolling. One way of doing this is to change the language that we use when we notice a thought. For example, if we notice the thought, "I didn't lock the door," we might practice trying saying out loud, "Right now my mind is giving me the thought that I didn't lock the door." We're acknowledging the thought our mind has given us, but we're separating this from fact. It can even be helpful to acknowledge the amazingly thorough job that our advisor is doing, rather than fighting it or wishing it away. We might practice saying, "Thank you, mind, for giving me the thought that I didn't lock the door. What a great job you're doing of trying to protect me, but actually I don't need your advice this time." The aim of this is not to respond to our thoughts with frustration, but just to notice and verbalise the fact that they're there. It might be that as we practice noticing thoughts, we also begin to notice reoccurring themes. Naming these themes or the types of thought that we have can also help us to step back from them. We might practice trying, "There we are, there's my mind giving me the 'I didn't do it properly' thought again. This is a thought I know well." Step 2. Visualise your protective advisor. Imagine for a moment that part of your mind that's your well-meaning advisor. This is part of you, but not all of you. Sometimes building an image of what this part might look like can help us notice and acknowledge when it's playing a part. It might be that you imagine this inner advisor to look a certain way, or to have a certain character or form. It might be that you simply imagine it as a colour or a shape. There's no right or wrong here, after all this is your own character. But it can help us to imagine this part of ourselves separately, the part that's doing its best to look after us, but doing its job a little too well. Having an image or a character to draw on when these thoughts show up not only helps us to notice thoughts, but also to create a bit of distance between us and the thought that we're having. Step 3. Challenge the thought that your mind gives you. Usually the thoughts that we experience show us the worst possible outcome, and our advisor is pretty good at convincing us that this is also the most likely outcome. Usually we don't stop to question this because the thought is frightening, and our urge is to respond to it as quickly as possible. What we don't usually do with these thoughts is weigh them up against the other possibilities or the other outcomes that our advisor probably doesn't usually encourage us to consider. Imagine a set of scales where we balance the distressing thought that we have on one side of the scale, and on the other side of the scale we begin to stack the other possibilities or outcomes that we maybe wouldn't usually consider, or even other experiences that we've had which maybe don't fit with the first thought our advisor has given us. Remember, this isn't about dismissing thoughts. It's about balancing them with other parts of information that our brain normally filters out. So questions to ask ourselves here might be, are there other possible outcomes? How many times have I had this thought before, and has it ever come true? Are there other experiences I've had that don't fit with this thought, or times where even the opposite has happened? Doing this doesn't get rid of the thought that we've had, but it can help to balance it out and give it some perspective so that it seems a little less scary and overwhelming for us. Step 4. Change what we do. The important part here is staying firm around what we do in response to the thought that we have had. Remember, our advisor will try to push us into taking any action that reduces possible risk, even if that risk is minimal, or even if it's there at all. It's our reaction to these thoughts, though, that gives them their power. If we stop responding to certain thoughts, we may begin to find that our advisor gets a bit stroppy, meaning that those thoughts temporarily get a bit louder. In a sense, our advisor is hoping that we will use our compulsive behaviours to make it safe again. This is a bit like waiting out a tantrum. It's difficult and it's uncomfortable. There's probably a big part of you that just wants to give in and make the tantrum stop. But the good news is, if we can ride it out without responding, over time thoughts become a little quieter and more bearable. Our advisor will still give us unwanted advice at times in the form of thoughts, but these will no longer feel as powerful or distressing, and we'll be more able to notice them and allow them to roll past on our conveyor belt. So let's talk about the other type of thought. This is the type of thought we might be less likely to admit to having, the shameful thought. These types of thoughts can feel shocking and disturbing to have, and may seem not to make any sense at all. Usually with these thoughts we feel frightened or ashamed by the very fact that we've had the thought in the first place. Usually these thoughts might involve imagining ourselves acting in a way that's morally wrong or inappropriate, perhaps violently or even sexually. These are the kinds of thoughts that we're pretty unlikely to discuss over the dinner table or even admit to having, even to our nearest and dearest. What most people don't realise is that actually these types of thoughts are really common, and most people do experience them from time to time. For a lot of people, these thoughts might be shrugged off as weird or odd, and our conveyor belt keeps on rolling, and we move on. But for some of us, we may attach more meaning to the fact that we've had this thought. And the very fact that this shameful thought even showed up for us in the first place is what we become fixed on. If this sounds familiar, it's likely that we begin to believe that having this thought means one of three things about us: that we're mad, that we're bad, or that we're dangerous. Because of this, we might find ourselves avoiding the situations or people that trigger these kinds of thoughts for us. We also might find ourselves doing things to undo or neutralise a bad thought that we've had. This means that we actually end up reinforcing a belief that our thoughts are dangerous, or even a belief that we are bad or dangerous for having them. In actual fact, these thoughts in themselves are not dangerous or even unusual. The very reason we experience them is actually probably because they're linked to the things we care most deeply about and the morals that we hold closely. With these thoughts, we can use the same techniques we've already explored, but in a slightly different way. With these thoughts, it's the meaning that we attach to having had the thought that's important to work with, not the thought itself. So again, we can notice and unhook from our thoughts. A thought is a thought that our mind has given us, but it doesn't mean anything sinister about us. A thought is a thought and not a reflection of our character. Again, we can say, I'm having the thought that, but a thought is not the same as an action. 2. Visualising our protective advisor. Again, we can do this. Your advisor is also likely to generate this shameful thought because it's attached to the things that matter deeply to you. We can try saying, my advisor is giving me this thought because it's attached to things that matter to me. Step 3. We can challenge our thoughts. In this case, we're challenging the meaning that we have attached to having had this thought in the first place, not the thought itself. We're challenging the second part of the thought, the part of the thought that tells us having this thought makes me a bad person, or having this thought is as bad as having done it. We might balance these types of thoughts by asking ourselves questions like, how many times have I had this thought? And how many times have I acted on it? How many times has having had the thought caused it to come true? Do other people experience shameful thoughts? 4. Changing what we do. Don't pretend you never had the thought. You did nothing wrong. We don't need to try to undo or neutralise the thought with compulsions. You did nothing wrong. We can voice the thought, we can name the thought, we can visualise it, but we don't need to respond to it to make it any less dangerous. This thought was exactly that, a thought, but it doesn't have the power to cause things to happen. These techniques might sound odd and completely against the things that you've tried up until now. But I wonder, how well has simply trying not to have unpleasant thoughts been working for you? It might feel surprising to realise that every human on the planet experiences bad, scary or shameful thoughts at times. But these thoughts are exactly that, thoughts that our mind gives us, not actions. They're not dangerous in themselves and they can't cause things to happen. So rather than trying to get rid and empty our mind of these thoughts, let's try something new. Let's try noticing them, unhooking from them, challenging them. Let's try taking the sting out of them using visualization. Let's let them be things that we no longer need to get rid of, but seen as part of our mind doing a good job of looking after us. Most importantly, these techniques are there to help us live alongside thoughts when they show up for us, and to help us respond differently to them when they do, so that we can break the vicious cycle. Thank you for watching, and if you're finding these videos helpful, please click on the next one to learn more.